War has long been one of humanity's most consequential actions, often marked by destruction, suffering, and ethical ambiguity. Yet across centuries, philosophers, theologians, and political leaders have attempted to grapple with a central question: can war ever be morally justified? This inquiry gave rise to what is known as just war theory, a framework designed to evaluate the moral legitimacy of war and its conduct. Originating from ancient philosophy and Christian theology, and later refined through modern political thought, just war theory offers ethical guidelines for when it is just to go to war, how war should be conducted, and what justice looks like after conflict ends. In this video, we explore the evolution and enduring relevance of just war theory in a world that continues to struggle with the morality of armed conflict. The origins of just war theory can be traced back to classical antiquity and early Christian philosophy. In the Roman tradition, thinkers such as Marcus Tullius Cicero introduced the idea that wars must serve justice and be waged under legitimate authority. However, the theory found its more systematic and moral articulation through Christian thinkers like Saint Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century of the Common Era. Augustine wrestled with the paradox of Christian pacifism and the need to defend society, concluding that war could be morally permissible if it was waged with the intention of restoring peace and order. Centuries later, St. Thomas Aquinas formalized these ideas by identifying specific moral criteria for warfare, embedding them into Christian scholasticism and later Western political thought. Just war theory is traditionally divided into distinct categories. The first is known as jus ad bellum, or the justice of going to war. This area addresses the conditions under which entering into armed conflict can be considered morally justifiable. Wars must be fought for reasons that are ethically sound, such as self-defense, the protection of innocent lives, or the prevention of large-scale atrocities. Importantly, war must be declared by a recognized and legitimate authority, such as a sovereign state or governing body. The intention behind war should aim toward peace and justice, not conquest or vengeance. Moreover, war must be a last resort, undertaken only after all reasonable diplomatic efforts have failed. There must also be a reasonable chance of achieving success, and the anticipated benefits of war must outweigh the expected harms. If these moral thresholds are not met, the act of going to war is considered unjust. The second category of just war theory is jus in bello, or justice in the conduct of war. Once conflict has begun, ethical standards continue to apply to the behavior of combatants and military leaders. One of the foundational principles here is discrimination, the obligation to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Civilians must never be deliberately targeted, and every effort must be made to avoid harm to those not actively participating in hostilities. The principle of proportionality also applies in this context, requiring that the force used in any military engagement be proportionate to the legitimate military objective. Excessive or indiscriminate violence is deemed morally and legally impermissible. These principles have become deeply embedded in international humanitarian law, particularly in the Geneva Conventions, yet they remain subject to interpretation and debate in modern warfare. A more recent addition to just war theory is the category known as jus post bellum, or justice after war. This aspect concerns the responsibilities that arise after the cessation of hostilities. War does not end with the silence of guns. The ethical obligations continue. The victors of war have a duty to restore rights and order, not to impose punitive or exploitative measures. Peace settlements should aim to rebuild political and civil institutions, support reconciliation, and ensure that justice is served through lawful accountability, such as the prosecution of war crimes. Post-war justice must avoid the moral pitfalls of revenge or domination, and instead foster conditions for lasting peace and dignity for all affected populations. Despite its enduring influence, just war theory has not gone unchallenged. Critics from the realist tradition argue that ethical considerations are often irrelevant in the brutal arena of geopolitics, where the survival of the state overrides moral scruples. Pacifist critics, conversely, reject the notion that war can ever be morally justified, pointing instead to non-violent resistance and diplomacy as the only acceptable responses to injustice. Furthermore, modern warfare presents challenges that classical just war theory did not anticipate. The advent of drone warfare, cyber operations, and asymmetric conflicts involving non-state actors has blurred the lines between civilian and combatant, authority and insurgent, aggression and defense. These developments complicate the ethical framework and demand new interpretations of age-old principles. The post-September 11 era, often characterized by the global war on terror, has particularly strained the traditional boundaries of just war theory. When wars are no longer formally declared, and when enemies are elusive networks rather than nations, how can we meaningfully apply concepts like legitimate authority or last resort? How do we measure proportionality in conflicts where military actions are continuous, dispersed, and often secret? These dilemmas reveal both the necessity and the limitations of just war theory in the contemporary world. Nonetheless, just war theory continues to shape the moral and legal discourse surrounding military conflict. Its influence is evident in the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, which prohibits aggressive war and affirms the right of self-defense. It also informs the judgments of international criminal tribunals and the policies of modern militaries. Military academies around the world teach just war principles as a means of cultivating ethical decision-making among officers and soldiers. In an age of increasing skepticism toward warfare, just war theory serves not as a justification for violence, but as a framework for moral accountability, a reminder that power must be exercised with restraint and that human dignity must be preserved even in times of war. In conclusion, the ethics of warfare as explored through just war theory challenge us to confront the profound moral stakes of military action. It does not glorify war or naively believe that conflict can be entirely purified of wrongdoing. Instead, it asks hard questions and demands serious answers about when and how we choose to wield the sword. As technology, politics, and society evolve, so too must our ethical frameworks. Yet the core aspiration of just war theory, to place moral boundaries around one of humanity's most destructive practices, remains as urgent today as ever. In reflecting on the justice of war, we are ultimately forced to reckon with what kind of world we want to live in and what principles we are willing to defend.